14 bombs, 30,000 pounds each, dropped by stealth aircraft that flew for 18 straight hours to reach a mountain in the middle of Iran. And when the smoke finally cleared, what investigators actually found underneath that mountain turned out to be nowhere near as simple as the headlines made it sound. This is the story of what happened when the United States dropped the single most powerful conventional bomb in its entire arsenal onto Iran's most heavily fortified nuclear site, and why, more than a year later, the question at the center of that operation still hasn't been fully answered. Was Iran's nuclear program actually destroyed, or did the regime simply move the most dangerous part of it somewhere else before the bombs ever landed? Let's start with the mountain itself, because understanding what makes this site so significant is the key to understanding everything that happened afterward. Fordow sits buried deep inside a mountain near the city of Qom, a facility that stayed completely secret from the outside world until 2009, when it was publicly exposed as a covert enrichment site. The main halls where Iran's centrifuges spun around the clock, enriching uranium sites somewhere between 80 and 90 meters below the surface, roughly 260 to nearly 300 feet of solid rock stacked on top of the actual target. For years, military planners across multiple administrations looked at that depth and concluded there simply wasn't a conventional weapon in the American arsenal capable of reliably reaching it. Israel had tried repeatedly to damage the site through other means and never managed to touch the core of it. The only weapon on the planet believed capable of actually punching through that much rock is the GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator. A bomb so large that only one aircraft in the entire United States military can carry it, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, and even then, only 2 at a time. Think about the sheer scale of that weapon for a second, because it's genuinely difficult to picture something that heavy actually falling out of the sky. 30,000 pounds is roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded school buses packed into a single steel casing, built to survive the shock of hitting solid rock at hundreds of miles an hour without breaking apart before it detonates. That's the entire engineering challenge behind a weapon like this. Most bombs are designed to explode on impact or shortly after. A penetrator has to do the opposite. It has to survive the impact, completely intact, tunnel its way through layer after layer of reinforced rock and concrete, and only detonate once it's reached the specific depth engineers calculated would put it in direct contact with the target. Get that calculation wrong by even a few meters and the entire strike fails. The bomb either detonates too early and only damages the surface, or it buries itself too deep and the blast never reaches the actual chambers it was aimed at. That's precisely why the targeting of this specific mission mattered so much more than the raw explosive power involved. Let's walk through exactly how this operation unfolded, because the sequencing here is genuinely remarkable from a pure military execution standpoint. In the days before the actual strike, Israel had already been hammering targets across Iran for over a week. But even Israel's own Air Force didn't touch Fordow directly because they simply didn't have the weapon capable of doing real damage to it. That job was reserved specifically for the United States. When the order finally came, 7 B-2 bombers launched on a mission that would become the longest B-2 combat sortie in years, and the largest operational use of that stealth bomber in its entire history. To maintain the element of surprise, the Pentagon ran an elaborate deception operation sending clear-throat decoy aircraft out over the Pacific in one direction, while the actual strike package quietly slipped toward Iran from a completely different heading. 4th and 5th generation fighter jets swept ahead of the bombers to clear any potential threats. More than 125 aircraft total were involved in supporting roles including refueling tankers and surveillance planes, and by the time Iranian air defenses had any real chance of reacting, the lead B-2 was already dropping its first bombs down the ventilation shafts at Fordow. Not a single shot was fired at any American aircraft going in or coming out. That's the kind of operational execution that gets studied in military academies for decades. Compare that to trying to sneak an entire freight train past a security checkpoint without a single guard noticing. Except the checkpoint is one of the most heavily defended airspaces in the Middle East, and the freight train is a formation of stealth bombers carrying the largest conventional bombs ever used in combat. The margin for error on a mission like that is essentially zero. One radar operator getting lucky, one decoy failing to pull attention in the right direction at the right moment, and the entire operation could have unraveled into exactly the kind of contested airspace scenario planners spent months trying to avoid. Instead, by all available accounts, it went off close to flawlessly from a pure execution standpoint, which is part of why the initial victory lap out of Washington felt so justified in the moment. The problem was never whether the mission itself succeeded tactically. The problem was what that tactical success actually accomplished strategically, and those turned out to be two very different questions. Here's where the target selection gets genuinely fascinating from a pure engineering standpoint. Rather than trying to simply blast straight through nearly 300 feet of solid mountain and rock in one shot, planners identified a specific point of vulnerability: the ventilation shaft structure connecting the surface down to the central corridor leading into the two main underground enrichment halls. That shaft represented a weak channel, a pre-existing path of least resistance that a penetrating bomb could exploit far more effectively than trying to brute force its way through solid stone. According to defense officials, the lead B-2 dropped 2 bombs directly down that shaft in what's been described as a double-tap strike. Essentially, the first bomb clearing the way, and the second one following through the exact same penetration point moments later to drive even deeper before detonating. Across the full operation, 12 of those 30,000-pound bombs went into Fordow alone, with 2 more dropped on Natanz, Iran's other major enrichment facility, while a submarine offshore fired more than 24 cruise missiles at the above-ground portions of a third site at Isfahan, just before the bombers ever entered Iranian airspace. Now let's get into what satellite imagery actually showed once the dust settled, because this is where the story starts to diverge from the initial celebratory headlines. Commercial satellite imagery captured in the days immediately following the strike showed at least 6 distinct impact craters clustered around 2 separate locations at Fordow. Exactly the kind of surface signature you'd expect from a coordinated bunker-buster strike targeting known access and ventilation points. Independent analysts, who spent weeks poring over that imagery, concluded the bombing had been precisely targeted, concentrating specifically on the points of structural vulnerability that had been identified in the facility's original construction plans. At least 1 penetration hole was confirmed sitting directly above the buried enrichment hall itself. Based on everything visible from orbit, the physical structure of Fordow appeared to be, in the words of independent nuclear analysts, likely destroyed and knocked out of operation entirely. But here's where things get genuinely complicated, because visible surface damage and confirmed destruction of what's actually stored inside a facility are 2 completely different questions. And this is exactly the distinction that got lost in the immediate aftermath of the strike. The president stood in front of cameras and declared that Iran's nuclear program had been completely and totally obliterated. His defense secretary used almost identical language, calling it a historically successful attack. And for a few days, that was the story everyone accepted. Then a classified intelligence assessment leaked to reporters, and the picture got a lot messier. That leaked report reportedly concluded the strikes had only set Iran's nuclear program back by a matter of months, not years. A dramatically different conclusion than obliteration. Israeli intelligence assessments landed somewhere in between, describing the damage as significant but stopping well short of total destruction. And the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog, was notably careful with his language from the very beginning, telling reporters it was simply too early to judge the full extent of what had actually happened underground, even while acknowledging that the centrifuges at Fordow appeared to no longer be operational. So you've got 3 different assessments sitting side by side. The White House calling it total obliteration, a leaked intelligence report suggesting a setback measured in months, and the United Nations' own nuclear inspectors essentially saying nobody outside Iran actually knows for certain because nobody outside Iran has been allowed back inside to check. That gap between the public celebration and the private uncertainty is exactly where the story starts to turn into something much bigger than a single bombing run, because destroying a building is one thing. Destroying what's inside that building, particularly when that building is buried under 300 feet of rock, and the country that owns it has every incentive in the world to hide the truth, is an entirely different and far harder problem. It's worth pointing out just how politically charged that disagreement over the damage assessment actually became in the days after it leaked. The Defense Secretary and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs held a public briefing specifically to push back against the leaked report, with the Defense Secretary calling the operation a historically successful attack and directly challenging critics for what he described as breathlessly focusing on early incomplete intelligence rather than waiting for the full picture. That's a genuinely unusual dynamic, a sitting Defense Secretary going out of his way to publicly rebut his own government's leaked intelligence assessment within days of an operation being completed. It tells you just how high the stakes were around controlling the narrative in that first critical week before independent satellite analysts and international inspectors had a real chance to weigh in with their own conclusions. And as that brings us to the single most important unanswered question hanging over this entire operation, the one that honestly changed everything the moment it came to light. Where did Iran's enriched uranium actually go? Before the strikes ever happened, Iran had accumulated a stockpile of roughly 400 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity, which puts it just a technical step away from weapons-grade material. 400 kilograms sounds abstract until you hear the actual comparison nuclear experts use. That amount is enough, if further enriched, to produce somewhere between 9 and 10 nuclear weapons. That stockpile represented years of patient, methodical work inside Fordow's centrifuge halls, and it was sitting in that facility, according to the IAEA's own last confirmed assessment, right up until the days immediately preceding the American strike. And that stockpile hadn't stayed static either. According to the IAEA's own reporting in the months leading up to the strikes, Iran's inventory of 60% enriched material had actually been growing, climbing by well over 100 kilograms in just a few months, eventually reaching somewhere around 440 kilograms shortly before the war began. That growth trajectory matters because it shows a program that wasn't simply maintaining a stockpile for research purposes. It was actively expanding its most sensitive material at a pace that had already alarmed international inspectors well before a single bomb ever fell. So the timing of this operation wasn't arbitrary. It came at a moment when the underlying material genuinely was approaching a threshold serious enough to justify the kind of extraordinary military response that followed, regardless of how the aftermath ultimately played out. Here's what satellite imagery caught in the 72 hours before the bombs actually fell. 16 cargo trucks showed up on the access road leading to Fordow's tunnel entrance. By the following day, most of those same trucks had relocated to a completely different area, roughly a kilometer away. Around that exact same window, the IAEA had already lost access to its own monitoring cameras inside the facility roughly a week earlier, meaning the outside world had essentially gone blind to what was actually happening inside Fordow at precisely the moment it mattered most. 2 Israeli officials later told reporters at the New York Times that Iran had very likely moved that 400 kilograms stockpile out of Fordow in the days before the American attack. A senior Iranian source separately told Reuters that almost all of the country's highly enriched uranium had been transferred to a secret location before the bombs ever fell. And a veteran investigative journalist who's built decades of credibility covering intelligence stories reported that roughly 450 pounds of that enriched material had specifically been moved from Fordow over to the reprocessing facility at Isfahan, the very same site that got hit separately by submarine-launched cruise missiles rather than bunker busters. So think about what that actually means if it's accurate. The most devastating, most technologically impressive strike in the history of American conventional weapons may have obliterated an empty building. Not literally empty, the physical infrastructure, the centrifuges, the enrichment cascades themselves, all of that appears to have been genuinely destroyed. But the actual fissile material, the specific ingredient that turns a civilian nuclear program into a weapons program, may have already been sitting somewhere else entirely by the time those bombs went off. That's not a minor footnote. That's potentially the entire ballgame. Now, to be fair to the other side of this argument, not everyone agrees that theory holds up. Months after the strike, a senior Israeli official told Reuters that, based on their own intelligence, the stockpile had not actually been removed and had not been moved since the strikes, suggesting Iran made no meaningful attempt to safeguard the material either before or after the bombing run. That same official acknowledged Iran might still theoretically be able to access material stored at Isfahan, but argued that actually moving it out at this point would be extremely difficult given the condition of the facility and the ongoing military pressure on the regions. So even within Israeli intelligence circles, you've got conflicting assessments about whether this material was successfully relocated or whether it's still sitting buried in the rubble of a facility that took a direct hit. Here's the honesty check that nobody in the initial victory lap wanted to sit with. Nobody outside of Iran actually knows for certain, and that's not because the evidence is ambiguous. It's because Iran has deliberately made sure nobody can verify it either way. In the immediate aftermath of the strikes, Iran terminated the fragile diplomatic arrangement that would have allowed IAEA inspectors to resume access at facilities that weren't directly hit. The agency's cameras, the ones providing continuous monitoring of Iran's declared nuclear material, had already gone dark the week before the strikes and have never been fully restored since. In the agency's most recent formal report to its Board of Governors, dated late February of this year, IAEA inspectors stated plainly that they have not had access to verify Iran's previously declared uranium inventories for well over 8 months, a gap the agency itself described as long overdue by any standard safeguards practice. Translation? From the world's own nuclear watchdog, in their own formal language, we genuinely do not know where Iran's enriched uranium currently sits. and we haven't known for the better part of a year. Let's talk about what happened at the physical site itself once the shock of the initial strike wore off, because this part of the story is almost as revealing as the missing uranium question. Within days of the bombing, fresh satellite imagery started picking up something that should have been impossible if the site had truly been rendered permanently inoperable. Heavy earth-moving equipment, excavators, cranes, construction trucks rolling in on newly built roads leading directly toward the impact craters. Independent weapons experts who reviewed that imagery assessed that Iran appeared to be filling in the craters, conducting engineering damage assessments of their own, and even collecting radiological samples from the site, presumably to determine internally just how much of their own program had actually survived. Iranian officials publicly admitted the facility had been, in their words, badly damaged. But the country's state broadcaster simultaneously pushed a very different narrative to its domestic audience, claiming the nuclear sites hadn't actually suffered a major blow because the sensitive materials had already been removed in advance, which, if true, would actually confirm the exact scenario Israeli and American intelligence officials were separately warning about, that Iran had gotten the important pieces out before the bombs ever landed and simply let the empty infrastructure absorb the hit. Meanwhile, the IAEA's own warnings only added more urgency to the uncertainty. The agency cautioned that even accounting for the physical destruction at Fordow, Iran could realistically resume some level of enrichment activity within a matter of months if it chose to, given that the fissile material itself, the expertise of its scientists, and the underlying political will to rebuild all remained fully intact, regardless of what happened to any single building. A senior advisor to Iran's supreme leader made almost exactly that same point publicly, stating flatly that even assuming complete destruction of the physical sites, the game wasn't over because the enriched materials, the indigenous technical knowledge, and the political determination to continue all still existed. That's not a subtle threat. That's a fairly direct acknowledgement from inside the regime that bombing a building, no matter how precisely targeted, doesn't erase the underlying capability to eventually rebuild it. That kind of statement, coming from someone that close to the actual center of power inside Iran, deserves more attention than it typically gets in the broader coverage of this story. Regimes don't usually go out of their way to publicly downplay the effectiveness of an attack against them unless they genuinely believe that downplaying serves their interests. And in this case, the interest being served is fairly obvious. If Iran can convince its own population and the broader region that the strike, however devastating it looked on satellite imagery, didn't actually eliminate the underlying program, that messaging does real strategic work. It reassures domestic hardliners that the broader nuclear ambition survives intact. It signals to neighboring countries that the threat calculus hasn't fundamentally changed. And it quietly undermines the American narrative of total obliteration without Iran ever having to prove a single specific claim. Because the ambiguity itself, the same ambiguity created by blocking IAEA access and refusing independent verification, does all the strategic work on its own. Let's fast forward and look at what's happened in the months since. Because this story didn't end with the initial strike, it kept evolving in ways that reinforce exactly how incomplete that first round of destruction actually turned out to be. Roughly 8 months after Operation Midnight Hammer, satellite analysts spotted something new entirely. Fresh impact craters at a previously obscure facility called Taleghan 2, with damage signatures strikingly similar to what had been documented at Fordow and Natanz after the original strikes. That similarity wasn't a coincidence. Analysts who compared the impact points concluded the damage pattern was broadly consistent with another massive ordnance penetrator strike, meaning the only aircraft in the world capable of carrying that weapon had likely gone back into Iranian airspace for a second, previously unpublicized round, against a target that had apparently been hardened and reinforced specifically in the months following the original attack. Central Command, when asked directly whether GBU-57s had been used again, declined to comment either way. But here's the deeper significance of that particular target. Taleghan 2 appeared to be roughly as deeply buried as Fordow itself, and had been very deliberately and very quickly hardened against exactly this kind of attack in the months immediately following the original war, which strongly suggests Iran had already begun quietly constructing a replacement enrichment capability almost as soon as the smoke cleared from the first strike. Think about the timeline that paints. Iran gets hit with the most powerful conventional weapon in the American arsenal. The world watches satellite images of craters and collapsed tunnels and celebrates what looks like a decisive program-ending blow. And within months, construction crews are already pouring concrete on a brand new hardened facility somewhere else entirely, built specifically to survive the exact type of attack that just leveled its predecessor. That's not the behavior of a regime that considers its nuclear ambitions finished. That's the behavior of a regime treating the original strike as a costly but survivable setback, one worth immediately rebuilding around rather than abandoning altogether. There's a term nuclear proliferation experts use for exactly this kind of pattern, sometimes called the whack-a-mole problem, and it captures the frustration perfectly. You spend enormous resources, risk highly trained pilots, and deploy your most sophisticated weapons to take down one specific target, only to watch a new target pop up somewhere else within months. Built by people who studied exactly what worked and what didn't the first time around and adjusted accordingly. Tel Aviv, too, being hardened so quickly and so deliberately in the exact window following the original strikes, suggests Iranian engineers didn't just accept the damage assessment and move on. They treated the entire episode as a design brief for what needed to be built differently next time. And that's a genuinely sobering thought for anyone hoping a single dramatic strike, no matter how technically impressive, could permanently settle a question this deeply rooted in a country's decades-long strategic ambitions. There's also a broader casualty count to this story that goes well beyond concrete and centrifuges. Iran's supreme leader, the man who had presided over the entire program for decades, is now dead, killed at some point during the broader conflict that followed the initial strikes. The Strait of Hormuz has been under a naval blockade for extended stretches since. Iran's ballistic missile launches have dropped by more than 90% from their peak intensity earlier in the conflict. A genuinely staggering collapse in operational tempo that speaks to just how thoroughly the broader military infrastructure supporting the missile program has been degraded through repeated strikes over the following months. So, on almost every conventional metric you could measure, the war that followed Operation Midnight Hammer has been devastating for Iran's overall military posture. And yet, on the one metric that arguably matters most, the actual physical location and status of the enriched uranium that could theoretically be turned into an actual weapon, the world remains exactly as uncertain today as it was in the confused, chaotic days immediately following the strike itself. Let's think through why that uncertainty matters so much more than any other piece of this story, because it's easy to get lost in the technical specifics of bomb penetration depth and crater analysis and lose sight of the actual stakes involved. A destroyed centrifuge hall is a serious setback, but centrifuges can be rebuilt given enough time, enough money, and enough political will, all of which Iran has repeatedly demonstrated it still possesses. Enriched uranium is a completely different category of problem. Once you have 400 kilograms of material enriched to 60% purity sitting somewhere, the remaining technical steps required to push that material the rest of the way to weapons grade are, according to nuclear proliferation experts, both faster and far easier to conceal than the original enrichment process itself. You don't need a massive, easily detectable facility carved into the side of a mountain to finish that last stretch. You potentially just need a much smaller, much more easily hidden setup, which is exactly the scenario every non-proliferation expert watching this story has been quietly worried about since the very first satellite images of those cargo trucks leaving Fordow came to light. There's also a psychological dimension to all of this that rarely gets discussed alongside the technical details, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Every single day that goes by without international verification doesn't just leave a gap in the public record. It actively shapes how every neighboring country in the region calculates its own security posture. If you're a defense planner in a country bordering Iran, you don't get the luxury of assuming the best-case scenario just because it would be more comforting. You have to plan around the possibility that the worst-case scenario, that Iran successfully preserved its most sensitive material, turns out to be true. That kind of regional uncertainty has its own destabilizing effect, completely independent of whatever actually happened underneath that mountain, because uncertainty itself becomes a strategic factor that shapes alliances, defense spending, and diplomatic posturing across the entire region for as long as it persists. So here's the honesty check on the entire operation, stepping all the way back to look at the big picture one more time. From a pure military execution standpoint, Operation Midnight Hammer was an extraordinary achievement. 7 stealth bombers flew halfway around the world, executed a complex deception operation, penetrated one of the most heavily defended and fortified targets on the planet, and returned home without a single shot fired at them. That part of the story deserves genuine recognition regardless of how you feel about the broader war. But military execution and strategic outcome are not the same thing. The honest answer to the question of whether this operation actually ended Iran's nuclear ambitions remains genuinely unresolved more than a year later. The buildings got destroyed. The uranium's location remains unconfirmed. The scientific knowledge and political will to rebuild clearly survived intact. And within months, satellite imagery was already picking up construction on what looks like a hardened replacement facility somewhere else in the country. What we're really looking at here isn't a simple story of a mission accomplished versus a mission failed. It's a much messier, much more honest story about the limits of even the most powerful conventional weapon on Earth when it's being used against an adversary with enough advance warning, enough institutional determination, and enough experience concealing exactly this kind of program from international inspectors for decades. 30,000 pounds of ordnance can absolutely collapse a mountain facility. It cannot, on its own, guarantee that the most dangerous material inside that facility was actually there when the bombs went off. And it cannot erase the underlying scientific knowledge and political will that built the program in the first place. That's the uncomfortable nuance sitting underneath all those dramatic satellite images and triumphant press conferences. And it's exactly the piece of the story that got buried under the initial wave of obliteration headlines. It's a nuance worth holding on to the next time a single dramatic strike anywhere in the world gets described in absolute final terms the moment the smoke clears. Wars involving buried, concealed, and deliberately ambiguous programs rarely resolve themselves in one clean afternoon, no matter how impressive the weapon or how flawless the mission execution turns out to be. Where does that leave things looking forward? The IAEA continues formally reporting, report after report, that it simply cannot verify Iran's declared nuclear material inventories, a gap that's now stretched past 8 months with no clear resolution in sight. Satellite analysts continue watching for fresh construction activity at hardened sites scattered across the country, with Taleghan 2 serving as proof that at least one such effort was already well underway within months of the original strike. And the fundamental question that mattered from the very first hours after those bombs fell, whether Iran successfully moved its most dangerous material out before the strikes ever landed, remains exactly as open today as it was when those 16 cargo trucks first showed up on satellite imagery outside Fordow's tunnel entrance. Sometimes the most consequential military operations in history don't end with a clean, satisfying answer. Sometimes they end with a question mark that lingers for years, quietly shaping every diplomatic decision and every intelligence briefing that follows, long after the news cameras have moved on to the next story. I want to know what you think about how this actually plays out from here. Do you believe Iran genuinely managed to relocate that enriched uranium stockpile before the strikes, effectively preserving the most dangerous part of its program, despite losing the physical infrastructure around it? Or do you think the material really was destroyed or rendered inaccessible, along with everything else at Fordow and Isfahan? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of question where reasonable people looking at the same evidence have landed in genuinely different places. And I'd love to hear how you're reading it. If this breakdown helped you actually understand what happened underneath all the celebratory headlines from that first week, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps get this kind of detailed analysis in front of more people, trying to separate the actual verified facts from the political spin on both sides of this story. And if you want to stay updated as the IAEA keeps issuing new reports and satellite analysts keep watching for the next hardened facility to show up somewhere in Iran, go ahead and subscribe, because this particular story is nowhere close to finished, and I'll be right here breaking down every new development the moment it surfaces. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.